Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 29 wildcard and free hit chip strategies video. My assumption is that you would have already played the bench boost at some point in the season, or you would be playing it this week. However, if you're playing it this week, you probably wouldn't be watching this video. The idea of this video is to cover players who still have a wild card, or still have the wildcard and free hit, or players who are just planning simply to play the free hit this week. And of course, it doesn't really matter what your chip strategy is because you're free hitting. As far as the first template, we have the Game Week 29 wildcard with no chips left. So assuming you don't have a bench boost, assuming you don't have a free hit, I would go for De Gea as my keeper here simply because you can actually avoid the issue of the 3 hit, or let's say the game week 32 blank, where you can just simply play Guaita that week where he plays Everton. So that's why I would go for De Gea. He has a very, very good fixture this week, and sidestepping Chelsea makes sense because Chelsea will also blank likely in game week 32. So I would still prefer the United assets if I had to compare them individually with the Chelsea assets at this point in time. So it makes sense for me to go into De Gea. And unfortunately, if you go with someone like Chilwell, that creates more issues for your team when it comes to navigating around blank game week 32. As far as Trent, the reason why we go for him there is because he doesn't have these issues. He doesn't have these blanks. And even though he doesn't have the best of fixtures this week, he's a great season keeper towards game week 38. So that's the strength of a player like Trent if you don't have any chips left. He still has a tremendous amount of attacking upside. This wildcard, of course, allows you to go away from Kane to capitalize on players who have more fixtures heading towards the end of the season, and Salah is a great example of that. That's why Salah becomes a make weight, and therefore also, since we have so many Brighton assets, since we have cheaper options like Solanke, as opposed to in the 3-4-3 structure where a lot of people are now holding Tony and Watkins, you now have enough money in the bank to go for someone like a Trent and actually hold him with a little bit of comfort. As far as Trippier and Dunk, these are options that I think are absolutely nailed. The reason why I've gone for Dunk over Estupinian on a wildcard template is because I feel like he will be nailed, and Brighton are also involved in the FA Cup. And if you cast your mind back to the comments that De Zerbi made 1 to 2 weeks ago, there are performances where Estupinian might be someone who could be benched at 50 minutes or 60 minutes, even earlier. Even though he actually has so much high attacking upside, I think there is some safety in going for Dunk here. I've also gone for a Burn on the bench. He's someone that will just cover Newcastle really well, and you can bring in Isak in the future for, let's say, someone like Watkins if you'd like to capture or capitalize on a future double game week for Newcastle. But Burn will just be sitting there waiting on the bench to actually be played for that reason. And White is someone that I think is lovely because with the recent injuries that Arsenal have succumbed, that pretty much nails White's position in the team for the rest of the season. So I like the fact that you don't have to deal with that issue. And White probably is someone that I would be happy to go with and to save a little bit of money on compared to a Gabriel, compared to a Zinchenko if I had to remake that decision. As far as the midfield, though, you have Rashford, Fernandes, McAllister, Matoma, and Salah. This is a super template midfield, and a super template midfield for specifically people who are trying to cover the double game weeks that go towards the end of the season. There's no Arsenal midfielders here, and that's going to be a huge sticking point for a lot of people. But if you are wildcarding, you want to capitalize on the fixtures ahead. And the beauty of wildcarding this week is you don't have to take hits, right, to go out of these Arsenal midfielders. So it doesn't feel so painful to go out of the single game week playing, Arsenal players to go into assets like Fernandes and Rashford who have doubles, or same with Salah, same with McAllister and Matoma. You can obviously change Matoma with March. I still really like McAllister because the underlying stats since he's moved to that 10 position have been fantastic. So I think he's actually the Brighton midfielder that I would prioritize the most in terms of transfers in. Matoma and March I think are very, very similar in terms of their ceiling and very close still ultimately to a McAllister. Salah, as I said, for the reasons that you're playing a wild card, just because you can capitalize on those fixtures, makes sense, and you can bin the money off for Kane. Also, this team, if you look at the bench, is deliberately saving monies to keep Haaland in your team. So if we actually find out that for whatever reason Haaland is going to succumb to, let's say, a long-term injury, you could change this template once again. I might even consider going for Kane simply and just benching him this week and playing him on the same logic that he's fantastic to play going forwards. Haaland is someone that I would happily keep on the bench because there's enough money and this team is strong enough because of the cheapness, I suppose, of the Brighton assets and someone like Solanke who covers you very well for game week 29 to accommodate for Haaland coming back on game week 30. And if he doesn't come back on game week 30, if he's injured, let's say to game week 32, then there's no reason to start going with him in a draft. I would just simply go for Kane at that point. As far as Watkins and Solanke, you could maybe go for a Chelsea asset, but keep in mind that that sort of impinges your team in game week 32. And as far as Solanke, he's just someone that you want as a placeholder in game week 29. There's no comparable option who's as cheap. So that's the issue with Solanke ultimately. And that's going to be the no chips left strategy. Moving on to the next template here, we have Wildcard 29 and 3 at 32. This is where we actually get to reincorporate these Chelsea assets and these United assets into our team, specifically Shaw, who I actually prefer to De Gea. So therefore, Shaw actually sits on the bench in Game Week 29. We can debate whether he actually deserves to be on the bench in Game Week 29. I'd probably start Trippier over him, but I know a lot of managers will see this and think that Shaw actually has much better fixtures than a Trippier. If you wanted to compare, let's say, and think that, let's say, the United Newcastle game is a both teams to score game as an example, then you're comparing, I guess, Shaw versus Brentford at home versus Trippier versus West Ham away from home, and maybe you'd actually prefer Shaw on that basis. However, this team anyways is specifically geared towards playing around 3 at 32. You can get Kepa in your team because I think Kepa, of course, is a very good replacement towards a De Gea that we previously showcased, and Chilwell actually could be a transfer out. So this team should hopefully have a little bit more budget because you're going for Everson as well. That should actually allow you to go for someone like a Trent in Game Week 30 or Game Week 31 if you wanted to move away from Chilwell, given that he actually has really good fixtures in Game Week 29, but not necessarily after that. As far as Dunk, though, he's, as I said, a season keeper, someone that I wouldn't really touch if I was wildcarding, and specifically the reason I'm going for him is because he's nailed compared to someone like Estupinian, who might just miss one game or two, or could be rested a little bit early. Let's say if De Zerbi is not happy with one of his performances, there could be a chance, of course, that Estupinian could be rotated out of the team a little bit early and subbed off. Dunk is not going to really face that issue. The midfield is exactly the same. It's a template midfield. It capitalizes on double game weeks. Mitoma and March replaceable, but then the forward line is very similar as well. Solanke and Watkins are both great options towards the end of the season. There's no reason to really sidestep Watkins. You could ultimately go for another Chelsea player if you really wanted to. There's no weakness really to going for Watkins, but I would say the reason why I've gone for Watkins here is because Havertz has a little bit of doubt hanging over him, and I wouldn't really go towards a wild card with a potential transfer in mind. Now, keep in mind, of course, that Havertz has an illness, but that still reduces the strength of your Game Week 29 team. So why start off a little bit weaker than you would be if you went for Havertz and he might have missed Game Week 29 or would have played overall less minutes due to the impact of the injury and how that's affected his training. So that's one thing to think about. That's why I think Watkins is great, because we've talked about in the recent weeks where actually that regardless of whether Havertz is playing or not, if you were to assume that Havertz was playing 90 minutes, Watkins is someone who is fantastic and actually compares very well to Havertz. So I would love to start with Watkins on a wildcard template. As far as the last template, this is going to be a free hit 29 template. So no kind of assumptions here with chip strategy or any transfers that you have. But the idea here is to go for Duncan and Estupinian, because for me, the best way to capitalize Game Week 29 is to choose the correct 3 Brighton assets if you're free hitting. Yes, the triple Brighton midfield is super tempting because the upside is there, but the reality is this week you have so many better midfield options that could actually bang, like a Salah, like a Maddison, like a Fernandes, and a Rashford. This is assuming, of course, that Rashford is ready to play the first game. Otherwise, if you were a bit of a maverick and you knew that Rashford was going to miss game 1 versus Newcastle, you could easily move away from Rashford into a Brighton midfielder or someone else like a Jared Bowen. However, if we just assume that everything is okay with all these players and that maybe Havertz is one to miss out, I've gone for Felix here as well in place of Havertz, just to not deal with any of the potential ramifications of Havertz not maybe training as much as he would have wanted. Therefore, I'm assuming that Felix would actually get more minutes this week and actually cover Havertz really well. And I prefer Felix and Isak independently to Solanke as well. Solanke actually has really, really good matchups compared to someone like Isak, who actually has 2 tough fixtures, arguably. But I like the ceiling of Isak, and with him being fully fit, with Eddie Howe not actually suggesting that he's had any fitness issues to deal with, I think Isak over 170 minutes is probably a better option to Solanke, at least in my estimations. Of course, Solanke is on penalties, but Isak is also equally on penalties. Maddison is the reason why I would go for double Brighton defense, going back to my original point. The reason why is because the replacement for Maddison in the midfield position, in my opinion, is still weaker than, let's say, a replacement for a Brighton defender this week. The replacement is probably going to be someone like Trippier, who you can see is on the bench. But I prefer, let's say, getting the upside of Maddison on a week like this, where he just simply has, on paper, some of the best matchups across all the assets this season that have actually done well in the midfield position. So we're comparing to the likes of Bruno, the likes of Odegaard, Saka, etc. like that. As far as Chilwell, fantastic matchup here, 2 home games, and even though one of the games is going to be Liverpool, ultimately these Chelsea and Liverpool games in recent memory have been very, very low scoring. I think Chelsea have always been very solid playing versus Liverpool. That's a bit of conjecture, but ultimately the clean sheet odds still bear out that Chelsea's going to have good chances to get a clean sheet this week, whereas Brighton are far superior compared to any other team. West Ham options could be considered, and that's why I put Aguerd on the bench. You could probably change that around if you actually really want to capitalize on a Brighton player, or let's say you wanted to take Rashford off the team because you knew he wasn't going to start a game. Felix is someone that I've chosen over Havertz for the injury kind of concerns, and then with Isak, for me, I just prefer him over Solanke. You could obviously go for Watkins as well. Watkins actually arguably has better fixtures than Isak, but I just think like Isak sometimes has a higher ceiling as a player. Watkins is someone who strikes to me almost like a budget king, where he's going to get 5 or 4 or 6 points every week. And Isak, if you look at the Nottingham Forest game, I mean, he could have even got an assist there and probably scored another time. I just think that he is a bit of a difference maker when it comes to creating a natural ceiling in FPL. So I would go for Isak over Watkins just to play around with the free hit. And that's going to be the video done with the wildcard and free hit template. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys shortly.